Welcome to APUSH. In this video, we're going to be looking at the larger empires of Central and South America. Despite the fact that this content is usually not extensively tested on the AP test, I do think it's important for you to have some appreciation of the societies that existed prior to any Europeans showing up. So, without further ado, here are your objectives for today. Pause the video and take them in. And let's dive into American empires. So we start with the Olmec Empire, going all the way back possibly to 1500 BC. The Olmec Empire was an extensive agricultural society. They had there's significant evidence of large-scale agriculture and large-scale settlement and all the things that come along with that. They had large cities, usually centered around the central ziggurat, which was a cultural/religious hub, similar to the ruins that you see in Maya and Aztec places, although obviously the Olmec have significantly deteriorated over time. They were settled in central Mexico here, sort of right along the southern portion or the southern portion of the Gulf of Mexico, and you can clearly see trade routes extending out into the Yucatan and into central, what is today Mexico. The Olmec, what we know about them, we know that they had extensive artwork, most famously the stone heads, which we assume had important religious implications because, you're carving a massive head out of a rock. Clearly, it means something important to you in order for you to spend the time and energy doing that. We also have some pretty sophisticated jade carvings here. And, some other religious iconography. Look, it's a fish, clearly. We also know some elements of Olmec culture because they originated some of the things that we most associate with the Mayan and Aztec civilization. So clearly there's some cultural blending and diffusion between the Olmec and then the Maya and then, of course, later the Aztecs. So the Olmec were the originators of part of the writing system, or at least the origin of the writing system that the Maya and Aztec used. Unfortunately, we cannot decipher Olmec writings. No one has discovered a Rosetta Stone for the Olmec language, and so we're left without we're left without the ability to translate their writings, and so that really hampers our ability to understand their culture. But we do know that they played the Mesoamerican ball game, which had clear religious implications. Hopefully, you're familiar with the Mesoamerican ball game. Players try to get a leather ball through a hoop significantly high up on the wall there using their elbows and their hips, with the goal being to win the game so you can be sacrificed to the gods and make everything right in Olmec society. There were also large stadiums designed for people to watch this, which tells us some things about their culture. Obviously, these rituals were very important, and people had free time, giving us probably some evidence of the division of labor and also perhaps a class system within Olmec society. Then you had the Mayan civilization, which formed after the Olmec civilization collapsed. The Maya took almost all the same elements of Olmec culture and incorporated into their culture. So you've got the pictographic writing system, you've got the Mesoamerican ball game, you've got a lot of the ziggurats that the Olmecs created. Mayans also created them, although the Mayans, we believe, are significantly more sophisticated. And of course, we have access to Mayan ruins at places like Chichen Itza, so you can go see the sophistication of the Mayan construction techniques and also their astronomers. And there's a lot of very cool use of shadows in order to create patterns and things like that, which we don't have time to get into, but if you have a chance, look it up. The Mayans are just fascinating. Mayans, as we can see here, were primarily settled in the Yucatan Peninsula, and we have a lot of, obviously, trade routes connecting to former Olmec territory and then all the way to where the Aztecs would eventually arise from. You can also see a variety of trade goods that the Mayans traded in, I should say. And we have artwork that is significantly more complex than anything we saw from the Olmecs. Mayans are most known for their scientific contributions, of course. Hopefully you're familiar with some of these, including the observatory at Chichen Itza, where they tracked astronomical movements pretty complexly in order to specifically create the Mayan calendar. which, as you lived through in 2012, did not predict the end of the world, but did which did calculate the dates and the movements of the seasons very precisely. They also had a numbering system, including a zero, which was very important. Obviously, you can ask your math teacher about why zero is an important mathematical concept, but it should be noted that among other advanced civilizations, the Mayans conceived of the idea of zero as a number. And then you've got the Aztecs, who eventually replaced the Mayans and were around when Europeans showed up. So, of course, we know far more about the Aztecs because the Europeans who interacted with them wrote about them significantly. The most the most sensationalistic part of Aztec society was, of course, the sacrifices, which we know about again because Europeans, wrote about them. Both the Olmec and the Mayans also used these sacrifices, but we don't know if they were as prolific as the Aztecs, with the ritual involving the high priest removing the still beating heart in order to ensure that the gods were pleased and Aztec society would go along unencumbered. The Aztec Empire controlled this area of central Mexico, somewhat overlapping with Olmec territory, but not really controlling much Mayan territory. The Aztec Empire was made up of their core states around the capital of Tenochtitlan and a series of tributary states in which these conquered peoples would have to provide gifts to the Aztecs, including valuable supplies, and then of course sacrifices. So it should be noted that within the Aztec Empire, you had the core Aztec peoples, and then a variety of conquered peoples who may or may not have been positively disposed towards the Aztecs, who, as we remember, may have killed a significant number of their people through these sacrificial rituals. So, not a totally unified and harmonious empire, but the military strength of the Aztecs kept the neighboring peoples in line and kept the Aztec Empire somewhat stable. We know that the Aztecs also demanded, as we said, valuable trade goods in tribute and had a significant trading empire as well. And the Aztecs' major wonder was their capital city of Tenochtitlan. Here we see it described by Hernando Cortez, who saw it firsthand. So pause the video and read his account if you're so interested. The city itself was situated on a lake and had causeways connecting the central city to the banks of the lake. Here we see a somewhat more or less stylized version of it. This made the capital almost impervious to attack because if an enemy army tried to approach the capital, they could simply pull up the causeways, and the city has a pre-designed moat all the way around it, making it impossible to storm. In order to take advantage of this unique geographical phenomenon, the Aztecs built floating gardens known as chiapas in order to help supply the city. So even if they were besieged, they had floating gardens nearby, guaranteeing that they would have a source of food long before or long after the conquering or the opposing army would run out of supplies and food. The Aztecs also built very complex irrigation channels in order to ensure that their crops had an adequate supply of water. And all of these accomplishments led the Aztecs to be a very powerful and long lived civilization. In South America, you have the Inca Empire, which we know something about as well, because, of course, Europeans explored there as well. The AP test does not cover South America, but I did think it was important to at least bring up the Inca Empire. It should be noted that, like the Maya and the Olmec, there were several precursors to the Inca Empire that we're just going to skip over because, time. So here's your Inca Empire, relatively large along the Andes Mountains and the coast of South America. You can see it expanded quite rapidly until reaching its peak around 1525. The Incan Empire was most known for its overcoming of geography. Here we see a Spanish explorer describing how the Inca Empire was set up and some pieces of the socioeconomic sort of agreement of the Inca Empire. So pause and read this. Obviously, with an empire so long and so mountainous, roads were the Inca's greatest accomplishment. And the Incan Empire was settled along two parallel roads going the entire length of the empire. Their Architectural techniques are also noted in that they were able to build fabulous temples even up in the Andes Mountains using terrace and steps. This is, of course, the city of Machu Picchu, which you can theoretically go visit, but apparently it's super crowded. And of course, because right now there's a pandemic, you can't go visit it or should not go visit it. But sometime in the future, maybe you'll get a chance to go visit it. Apparently, it's breathtaking. And the road building of the Incans was legendary, comparable to the roads that the Romans built, using limited technology, but being able to build these long lasting roads that are still usable today. Here you see the two roads along the length of the Incan Empire, connecting the entire thing together. Of course, roads are important for trade, for travel, and for moving armies around, for governments, allowing governments to project their power. These roads also had a complicated postal service in which running messengers could run messages up and down the empire very quickly using a series of knotted cords in order to give complex messages even over long distances. And so this relay sort of message system allowed the Incan kings to communicate with their subordinates throughout their massive amount of territory. Unfortunately for the Incas, they lack, again, the large domesticated animals. They did have access to llamas and alpacas, but again, as we talked about previously, not super useful creatures. Although, I mean, they're large and they have fur and you can like put stuff on them occasionally. But as far as like getting them to do real work for you, yeah, that's not going to happen. They also developed, because of course they live in the mountains, terraced farming plots, which allowed them to make better use of their limited agricultural land. And so that's the Incan Empire and their accomplishments, overcoming the geography of the coastal plain of South America, and then the Andes Mountains. So here's your objectives again. Make sure you can clearly answer these questions. And when we come back next time, we'll be talking about European exploration, the motives, and we'll be getting to Columbus, that guy that we're not sure how we feel about.